Good evening from Kigali, Rwanda. This is Josh Friedman outside the flashy and colorful Kigali Convention Center, which opened just a few years ago. Actually, I think less than 3 years ago. The Convention Center is very much a symbol of the new Kigali and the new Rwanda, which I will be discussing momentarily. But first, I'd like to remind you that practically 25 years ago, in fact, it was April 1994, and we're in March 2019. So right now, we're just about coming up on the 25th anniversary of the Rwandan Genocide, when there were upwards of 1 million people killed in this country. It's not very large of a country. It was a large percentage of the population. And people were being butchered in the streets. Families were turning on one another. Neighbors were turning on one another. It was about as ugly as the scene could get, and the country was on the brink. People had fled to neighboring states as refugees. Both Tutsis and Hutus, by the end of the genocide, had fled. The country's economy had plummeted. And yet, a quarter century later, Rwanda is seen as a shining example of economic growth and good governance on the African continent. And this building behind me, this convention center with its flashing lights and twirling appearance at night, it's kind of a symbol, it's kind of emblematic of what has been achieved in Rwanda and in Kigali over the past quarter century. Granted, there's kind of a downside to that as well, which I'll be addressing later on in this video, but this video is very much about how over the past quarter century, Rwanda has gone from genocide to now being known by some as the Singapore of Africa. And I gotta say up front, I have not been to Singapore, so I'm not one to vouch for exactly what Singapore is like, but I think there are many comparisons that can be drawn between Rwanda and Singapore, and why not delve right into them? So, over the past quarter century, but largely since the year 2000, when the current president Paul Kagame formally rose to power, largely since then, there's been incredible economic growth in this country. Between 2000 and 2017, over an 18-year period, Rwanda's averaged just about 8% growth a year. It's sustained that over the course of pretty much 2 decades. So, like Singapore, it went from not very rich to shooting up. Not that Rwanda is rich now by any means, we'll be getting into that, but very rapid economic growth. And also, like Singapore, that economic growth has been accompanied by rather restrictive social policies and a bit of a crackdown on, definitely restriction on civil liberties. So Paul Kagame's been accused of running a pretty authoritarian regime here with very little respect for civil liberties and political freedoms. Kagame's won recent elections with totals like 95% and 99%. But things are very orderly here. By African standards, Kigali is a very clean, speaking of Singapore, very orderly, very safe city. And Rwanda as a country, likewise, is pretty clean, pretty safe, pretty orderly. And as is the case with Singapore, that's to some extent enforced by mandate. There are such things as government-mandated community cleanups here. I think there's some reason why the streets are pretty spotless. It's nearly enforced by decree. And Also with Kagame's rule and style of governments and enforcement of rules like forbidding the Hutu-Tutsi conflict reappearing in public life and in politics, stuff like that, is keeping things pretty safe. So it's very similar to Singapore in the sense that there's been rapid economic growth. Kigali and Rwanda are known to be very safe by African standards, extremely clean by African standards. By African standards, the streets are pretty much spotless. And while there's been this economic growth and order restored in the country, there's simultaneously been quite a restriction on civil liberties. So I think you can understand the Singapore comparison, even if it's coming from someone who has not been to Singapore, and I do very much hope to visit Singapore sometime in the near future. As for the rest of this video, I'd like to discuss a little bit of a breakdown of this economic growth and how Kigali came to be, or is it, this modern, technologically advanced African city, and likewise for the country. So I've already said that there's been an average of pretty much 8% growth over the past couple decades, and various reasons could be given for that. Now, there are some allegations that Kagame's government has cooked the books, but I'm not going to get into that, and it's quite clear that there has been significant economic growth, so there's no reason to question that there's been major economic growth. Now, some of the foundational policies behind that has definitely been related to a lurch toward a free market, rather liberalized economy. If you look at the World Bank's ease of doing business index and rankings, Rwanda has shot up by epic proportions. In the latest index, they're all the way up to 29 worldwide out of, I think, 180 or 190 countries. And Rwanda's the highest ranked country on the entire African continent. I believe Mauritius within Africa technically is ranked higher, but on the continent, Rwanda is the highest ranked a lot higher than a lot of Western countries and economies. And I hear government ministers saying some things like, oh, it only takes 6 hours to register a business in Rwanda. Well, if that's the case, you could understand why it's shot up in these rankings. And Rwanda's done a lot to attract foreign investment, and certainly been by creating a business and economic climate that is very friendly to business. They've got some special economic zones here in Rwanda, and from what I've understand, they've made it very attractive for businesses from all over. There's been a lot of investment from China here. There's also US investment. They've really made Rwanda an attractive place for business and investment. And speaking of which, I didn't really get into the convention center. Part of the backbone of this rapid economic growth and the policies under Kagame has been this Vision 2020 plan for Rwanda, and that gets into, by the year 2020, it's the goal of the country to be a middle income country, and for the economy to be shifting to a more IT based economy, partially service based and tourism based. And this is definitely a symbol of Rwandan tourism. It's actually part of the Radisson Blu Hotel. It's all one complex, and the convention center is operated by the Radisson Blu. The convention center is a public-private partnership. It's definitely not entirely private, and it's used for events like an African Union Summit. I think that was back in 2016. But anyway, so there's this Vision 2020 plan, and by 2020 they want to be a middle income country, and I'm not so sure how well that is working out. There's still fairly high poverty rates. The latest figures I've seen are 39%, which are not current, and it's actually dramatic improvement. So like over a decade, they shot up from 59% to 39% poverty rate. Still, the GDP per capita is very low here. It's in the 160s out of close to 200 countries worldwide in the rankings that I've seen. However, as with the poverty, there's been rapid increase in the GDP per capita ranking of the country, but it's still very low. And some of the criticism, some of the people are saying, yeah, there's been economic growth, but Rwanda was starting from so low that the economic growth is not that impressive. But I think that's more of just personal critique of Kagame. There's definitely been very noticeable economic growth here, but at the same time, I can say from traveling around just outside of the city center, you can pretty quickly go from some very modern looking buildings and communities and developments to some fairly typical rural, fairly impoverished African-looking communities within Kigali. So, to me, it's kind of a city of contrast. You've got the new, you've got the economic growth, you've got the advancement, but you also have a lot of people lagging behind. There's definitely still a lot of poverty in this country, and it shows both in person and it shows in the statistics. But certainly there has been very, very noticeable growth. So I would say that over a quarter century, it's very impressive how far Rwanda has come. Now it stands to be seen whether this 2020 vision, it's practically 2020 already, is going to become a reality. The economy is still very much based on production and export of coffee, tea, some minerals. It stands to be seen whether it's going to be a technologically advanced country and economy, and whether people are really going to rise up out of poverty, and how things are going to play out in the future with respect to the political situation here, because Kagame has changed the constitution so that he could stay in power until the year 2034, which would pretty much make him a president for life. So it's going to be interesting to see how, for instance, the West will respond to Kagame's continued rule over the next decade plus, whether relations are going to continue to improve, or maybe the West is going to say that's enough. We don't want to continue to invest in a country that's ruled by a president for life. I'm sure China doesn't mind, but those are some things to, and for that matter, will Kagame manage to continue to navigate the domestic political situation with complete control over the country and pretty high popularity as he has done so far? So those are some things to be seen, but as you can see, there has been tremendous economic growth here, and it's pretty incredible how far this country has come in just 25 years. And oh yeah, I guess it resembles Singapore quite a bit, at least by African standards. So I hope you enjoyed this look at Kigali and Rwanda and the impressive progress it has made over the past quarter century, and hearing a little bit about some of the backstory to that. If you enjoyed the video, please leave it a like and share it. There's more to come from Rwanda. Murakoze Chani, and goodbye for now.